The clock on the microwave read 12:04 when Walter Hartley lifted the first suitcase from the floor of the guest bedroom. He did not set it down on the bed. He did not want to hear the springs creak. He held it at his sidearm, extended the weight pulling at his shoulder the way it always did now since the surgery, and he waited. Eleanor was already at the door. She moved the way she had learned to move over the past 5 months, which was to say she moved like someone who had studied the architecture of someone else's house with the specific intention of becoming invisible inside it. She knew which floorboard outside the master bedroom would groan if you stepped on the left edge. She knew the guest bathroom faucet dripped for 3 seconds after you turned it off. She knew the side door, if you lifted the handle slightly while turning it, would close without a sound. She knew these things the way a guest learns the rules of a place that will never belong to her. Biscuit walked between them. He was 10 years old, his muzzle gone silver, and his left hip stiff on cold mornings, and he had not made a sound. Dogs understand more than people credit them for. He followed Eleanor past the kitchen and stopped at the foot of the stairs, and he looked up toward the second floor the way he sometimes did when the children called his name from their rooms. He looked for one breath. Then he turned and followed Walter toward the side door. Eleanor stopped at Sophie's room first. She did not open the door. She stood at the threshold with one hand raised, fingers hovering an inch from the wood, and she stayed there long enough that Walter turned and looked at her from the hallway. He did not speak. He had learned in 51 years of marriage that there were moments when Eleanor needed space to do something without an audience, even his. From the small bag she carried on her shoulder, she took out a tin, the kind that once held butter cookies, and now held something else entirely. She had baked them yesterday afternoon in the kitchen of their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, 3 houses down, a woman who had loaned her mixing bowls and flour and asked no questions. The cookies were round and frosted, each one decorated with a small sugar face, 2 dots for eyes, and a curved line for a smile. Sophie had asked for cookies with faces 17 times since they moved in. Eleanor hung the tin from the door handle by its ribbon and let it rest against the wood. She moved to Owen's room. On the windowsill between the small curtain and the glass, she placed a bird. Walter had carved it during 3 nights of insomnia, sitting at the narrow table in their room with a lamp bent low and a pocket knife he had kept for 40 years. It was a sparrow or something close to one. The wings were not perfectly symmetrical. The beak was perhaps slightly too long. But it was a bird, and it was made from the wood of a maple branch that had fallen in the backyard, and it had been made by hands that had built furniture for hotels and homes and one very particular house on Clover Street, and Owen would know that. Then Walter did something Eleanor did not expect. He walked to the kitchen. She followed him. In the light from the street coming through the window above the sink, she watched him open his wallet and remove a photograph. It was small and creased at the corners, the kind of photo that had been carried too long in leather. She could see it even in the low light. 3 children standing in front of a white house with green shutters. Marcus in the middle with his arms spread wide as if he was trying to hold his brother and sister simultaneously. Audrey laughing at something off camera. Colin standing straight the way he always stood in photographs, like he thought posture was a form of good character. Burlington, Vermont, 1998, the house on Clover Street. Walter looked at the photograph for a moment, then he placed it face down on the kitchen table. Not for Colin, not for Diana. He set it down the way a man sets down a weight he has been carrying too long with care and without ceremony, and he turned and walked to the side door. Eleanor understood. He did not want to carry that grief forward. He was leaving it here in this house, in this kitchen, where it had been slowly killing him anyway. She lifted the handle. The door opened without a sound. They stepped into the March night. They were gone before the clock reached 12:07. 8 months earlier, the house on Clover Street was still theirs. Walter had built it in 1976 when he was 28 years old and possessed of a confidence that only youth and good lumber can produce. He had framed it himself over one summer, working weekends and evenings, while Eleanor packed school lunches and graded papers and kept 3 children from destroying each other. By October of that year, there was a roof. By Christmas, there was heat. By the following spring, there were flower beds along the front walk that Eleanor filled with lavender and climbing roses, and the house on Clover Street became the kind of place that people slow down to look at when they drive past. He had worked as a finish carpenter for 31 years, building custom furniture for hotels and private clients, the kind of work that required patience and precision and a willingness to start over when something was not right. He retired at 64 with hands that ached in cold weather in a workshop behind the house where he continued to build things simply because not building things was not something he was capable of. Eleanor had taught third grade for 30 years at Burlington Elementary. She had taught reading and long division and the habit of looking people in the eye when you speak to them, and she had done it with a consistency and warmth that parents still mentioned to her in the grocery store years after their children had grown and moved away. They had 3 children. Marcus was the middle one, the boy who laughed the loudest and drove the fastest and joined the army at 22 because he said he wanted to do something that mattered. He was killed in Afghanistan in 2014 when a transport vehicle hit a roadside device in a province whose name Walter had to look up on a map the night the officer knocked on their door. The folded flag from his funeral stood on the shelf in the living room of the house on Clover Street, in the same spot where it had been placed the day they brought it home, and it had not been moved in 11 years. Audrey was the youngest. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and a talent for painting that neither of them had known what to do with until she found her own answer. She married a man named Pierce who worked in international diplomacy, and they moved to Melbourne 8 years ago. She called on Sundays for a while. Then the calls became monthly, then occasional. Eleanor understood, or told herself she did. Audrey was busy. Australia was far. Time zones made things complicated. These were the explanations Eleanor gave herself, and she believed them, and she would continue to believe them for several months more. Colin was the oldest. He had his father's discipline and his mother's warmth, and for most of his life, those two things had balanced each other adequately. He ran a custom furniture business of his own, having learned the trade from Walter over years of weekends in the workshop. He was good at it. He had been good at it. Then the economy contracted in the way it does every several years, and the orders for custom furniture slowed and then stopped, and Colin found himself standing in a workshop full of beautiful unsold things, while the bank began sending letters he left unopened on the kitchen counter. He had married Diana when he was 36. She was precise and organized and had opinions about most subjects which Walter had taken initially as a sign of intelligence. He had not been entirely wrong about that. What he had taken longer to understand was that Diana's opinions were not open for revision. The fall happened on a Tuesday in September. Walter had been meaning to fix the leak above the back bedroom for 3 weeks. The roofer he called had not called back. The second roofer he called wanted $400 for what Walter estimated was an hour of work, and that estimation was, as Eleanor pointed out afterward, the entire problem. He went up the ladder at 9 in the morning. He found the damaged section. He was reaching for it when his left foot slipped on wet composite shingles and he went down the slope in the particular way that falls happen, which is to say all at once and with no possibility of revision. He remembered hitting the gutter with his hip. He did not remember the ground. The hospital bill came to $47,000. Emergency surgery, a titanium plate, 8 screws, and 6 weeks of inpatient rehabilitation. Medicare covered roughly half. The supplemental insurance policy they had carried for 12 years had lapsed the previous month when the premium increase came through, and Walter had set the notice aside intending to deal with it after the leak was fixed. He lay in the hospital bed on the second day and looked at the ceiling and said, "We'll manage." Eleanor, who had been awake for 36 hours, said, "I know we will." It was Dale Morrow who said what nobody else would say. Dale had lived 3 houses down on Clover Street for 20 years. He was 62, a retired building inspector with a face like weathered oak and the habit of saying true things in direct language without apology. He came to the workshop 2 weeks after Walter came home from the hospital, while Walter was standing at his bench pretending to assess a piece of cherry wood he had no current use for. "Walter," Dale said, settling onto the stool by the door, "I heard Colin's in trouble. Business is slow." "I heard it's more than slow." Walter set down the wood. "He's got some debt." "You thinking about selling?" Walter did not answer immediately. Outside, a squirrel crossed the fence line, then changed its mind and went back the other way. "Eleanor thinks it makes sense," Walter said finally. "House is too big for 2 people, especially now with my hip." Dale looked around the workshop, the workbench with its rows of chisels and planes, the lumber rack along the far wall organized by species and thickness, the cabinet he had been building for 18 months slowly because there was no rush. 47 years of accumulated intention organized along the walls of a 12 by 16-foot room. "You're selling what you built," Dale said, "not what Colin built." Walter looked at him. "I know that," Walter said. "You won't have space for any of this at his place," Dale said. Walter did not answer. He picked up the cherry wood again. Dale sat for another few minutes in the way old friends sit with each other without obligation, and then he stood and went home. It was the last real conversation they would have before Walter left Burlington. That evening, Eleanor came into the workshop and found Walter standing very still at the bench with his back to the door. "The Hendersons' realtor called," she said. "I know. She thinks we could get enough to clear the medical debt and give Colin what he needs to keep the house and the business." "I know." Eleanor waited. "It's a house, Walter." "I know what it is." "Then you know it's also lumber and drywall and 47 years of tax payments." He turned around. His face had the look it sometimes got when he was working out the tolerances on a complicated joint, the look of a man calculating something with no room for error. "The garden," he said. "You planted it yourself. Plants can be transplanted." "The workshop. You built one before, you could build another." She was not dismissing the weight of it. She was lifting her side of it. He recognized the difference. He had been married long enough to know that Eleanor never minimized loss. She just refused to let it become a destination. 2 days later, Eleanor was pulling her winter coat from the closet in preparation for packing when a folded piece of paper fell from the pocket. She picked it up, unfolded it, and recognized her own handwriting. It was a garden plan she had sketched the previous spring, a rough diagram of where she intended to plant, in the bed along the south wall. Climbing roses along the fence, a dwarf apple tree, lavender in a row along the path from the gate. She had forgotten she had written it. She looked at it for a moment, then set it on the dresser and went back to the closet. She did not see Walter come into the room 10 minutes later. She did not see him look at the plan on the dresser, fold it carefully along its original creases, and slide it into the inside pocket of his wallet. He said nothing. She never knew he had taken it. The day they signed the papers, the weight in the room was the kind that no legal document can account for. The realtor was professional and efficient and spoke in the cheerful registers of someone who understands that she is witnessing a transaction but has trained herself not to see what the transaction costs. Walter signed where indicated. Eleanor signed beside him. The notary stamped the page with a sound that seemed too small for what it represented. They drove home in silence. Colin's house in Oak Ridge Estates had 5 bedrooms, a 3-car garage, and a backyard that could have accommodated a swimming pool and a tennis court simultaneously. By any measurable standard, space was not a problem. The guest room was at the end of the second-floor hallway past the children's rooms and across from the linen closet. It measured perhaps 11 by 13 feet. The queen bed fit, a dresser fit beside it. Between the foot of the bed and the wall, there was enough space to walk, but not comfortably. Walter's remaining tools, the ones Dale had not mentioned, and Walter had not been able to leave behind, went into 3 boxes stacked in the corner of the garage behind the Christmas decorations. Diana had prepared a dinner for their first evening. There were flowers on the table. There was lemon chicken, which Eleanor had once mentioned she liked. The children, Sophie at 5 and Owen at 4, were clean and combed and seated, and they looked at their grandparents with the uncomplicated joy that children bring to reunions. Dinner was warm and careful, and the conversation stayed in safe waters, and when Eleanor looked at Colin across the table, he smiled at her in a way that was genuine. And also she thought the smile of a man who was trying very hard not to look relieved. She understood. They had saved his house. His children would not change schools. His wife would not have to explain to her friends that the business had failed. Eleanor understood all of this and was glad of it, and she told herself that the guest room was fine and that she could quilt anywhere there was decent light. What she had not anticipated was the particular texture of Diana's management. It did not come all at once. It arrived in increments, which is how certain kinds of harm are designed. The first week brought small gestures of welcome questions about comfort offers to adjust the thermostat. The second week brought adjustments to the household that were presented as matters of practicality. Eleanor's armchair, the one she had owned for 17 years, and in which she had read approximately 400 books, was moved to the basement because the living room was being rearranged for a new entertainment system. Walter's toolboxes were shifted further back in the garage because the children needed space for their bicycles. The third week brought the baked goods incident. Eleanor had been teaching Sophie how to make cookies with faces in them. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Sophie had been asking for 3 weeks, and the kitchen smelled like butter and vanilla, and the particular happiness of something being made without purpose except pleasure. Sophie was standing on her step stool, pressing candy eyes into raw dough, when Diana walked in from the garage. She stopped at the kitchen entrance. She looked at the flour on the countertop, at the scattered candy decorations, at the bowl of batter, and the baking sheets, and the general evidence of a kitchen being used by people who were not measuring the cleanup in advance. Eleanor, she said, and her voice was not raised, which was the thing about Diana that Walter would later say was the hardest to describe the way the harm was delivered in a completely reasonable register. This countertop is Carrara marble. It's imported. Baking flour in the grain is extremely difficult to remove properly. Sophie looked at her grandmother. Then she looked at her mother. Her hands were still pressed into the dough on her stool. Eleanor looked at the marble. Then she looked at Sophie. She smiled at her granddaughter with the full warmth she possessed. "You're absolutely right," she said to Diana. "We'll clean up right now." After Diana left the room, Sophie tugged on Eleanor's sleeve. "Grandma, are you sad?" Eleanor looked at her granddaughter. 5 years old, flour on her nose, asking the exact right question. "No, sweetheart," Eleanor said. "I'm just thinking." It was the first time she had lied to Sophie. Colin had been standing at the kitchen doorway. Eleanor did not look at him, but she felt him there in the peripheral way you feel a person who is present but not participating. She heard him draw breath. She waited. She heard him release it. She heard his footsteps retreat toward his office. Later, she would think about that moment often. Not with bitterness exactly, with the particular sorrow of watching someone you love fail a small important test. What she could not have seen because she was looking at Sophie was the look on Colin's face in the moment before he turned away. He was looking at his father. Walter was sitting in the chair in the corner of the kitchen, the one Diana had not yet found a reason to remove, and he was looking at his son with an expression that was entirely without accusation. It was simply a look of recognition. "I see you. I know what you're choosing." That night, Colin did not sleep. The matter of the tools happened on a Wednesday 3 weeks later. Walter went to the garage to retrieve the smaller of his two toolboxes, the one that held his chisels and his marking gauges, because he had noticed that the hinge on the guest bathroom cabinet was pulling from the wall, and he intended to fix it. He found the Christmas decorations. He found the bicycles. He found Owen's old stroller and 3 boxes of Colin's college textbooks in a rolled-up area rug and a deflated basketball. He did not find his toolboxes. He stood in the garage for a long moment. On the concrete floor where the boxes had been, there was still the faint outline of grime in the exact shape of the bottom of his tool chest. 30 years of workshop residue, the particular signature of tools that have been used and cleaned and set down in the same place for so long that the place itself remembers them. He found Diana in the kitchen. "The toolboxes," he said. She looked up from her phone. "Oh, I meant to mention that. There was a donation drive for the vocational program at the high school. I thought it would be a good use for them since you're not working on any projects at the moment." He looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression of complete untroubled reasonableness. "Those were my tools," he said. "Some of those planes were my father's." "I'm so sorry, Walter. I didn't realize they were sentimental. I thought since they were in the garage." He said nothing more. There was nothing more that would have accomplished anything, and he knew it, which was perhaps the worst part. He turned and walked back through the kitchen and down the hall to the guest room, and he sat on the edge of the bed. Eleanor came in 10 minutes later. She closed the door. She sat beside him. Neither of them spoke. Biscuit came from his corner and set his heavy chin on Walter's knee, and Walter put his hand on the dog's head and sat there until the particular quality of the silence shifted from unbearable to merely heavy. He never mentioned the tools again. By January, Diana had escalated from inconvenience to architecture. The fall and the night came 3 months after their arrival. Walter woke at 3 in the morning needing the bathroom. His hip, which the doctor had said would continue to improve, but had not improved at the rate the doctor predicted, required him to move carefully in the dark. He navigated the space between the bed and the wall, reached the bathroom door, and caught his foot on a small, decorative rug that had appeared near the threshold sometime in the previous week. He went down against the door frame with enough force to wake the household. Lights came on in sequence. The hallway, the master bedroom, the children's rooms, where 2 small faces appeared in 2 doorways like worried moons. Diana emerged last, and her hair was, Walter noted, with the strange clarity of adrenaline, perfectly arranged. Colin helped his father to his feet. The hip ached with a sharp persistence that was different from his usual complaint. Walter insisted he was fine. Diana said it was exactly what she had been worried about. Colin said it could happen to anyone. Diana said it was 3 in the morning. The next day, she arranged a home safety assessment with a company that specialized in senior modifications. A young consultant arrived with a clipboard and walked through the house, and his recommendations, framed in the careful language of concern, consistently mapped onto one outcome: the restriction of Walter and Eleanor's movement and autonomy within the space they nominally shared. The most memorable moment came near the end of the assessment. We could implement a fluid management protocol for evenings, the consultant said, to reduce the need for nighttime bathroom trips. He was perhaps 30. He was wearing khaki pants. Or, Diana added with the same equanimity she brought to discussions of grocery lists, there are adult incontinence products that might offer peace of mind. She was discussing this in front of Walter. She was discussing this in front of Eleanor. She was discussing this as though it were a practical matter of household management rather than a declaration that two human beings who had built a life across 5 decades were now, in her estimation, maintenance problems to be solved. Walter looked at the wall behind the consultant's head. He looked at it for a long time. Later, he could not have said exactly what he was thinking. He could not find the word for what it feels like when someone uses the language of care to strip you of your dignity. He had never needed a word for it before. That night, after the consultant and Diana had left the kitchen, and Colin had retreated to his office with the defeated gait he had developed over the preceding months, Eleanor went to the bathroom alone. She stood in front of the mirror with the door closed. The woman who looked back at her had silver hair and a face she recognized, and eyes she was accustomed to finding a specific thing in which was certainty. The certainty that she knew what she was doing and why she was doing it and who she was. She looked for a long time and she could not find it. The thought that arrived was not dramatic. It did not come in a wave. It came quietly the way the most dangerous thoughts always do. What if Diana is building a case because there is something to build a case about? What if the plant overflow was not an accident but a symptom? What if the stove, the one time she had left the burner on while attending to Owen's scraped knee, was not an exception, but a pattern she had not yet recognized in herself? She put both hands on the edge of the sink. She bent her head. She did not cry. She stayed there until Walter, who had heard the water running for too long, opened the door quietly and found her. He did not ask. He put his hand on her back, just his hand flat and warm between her shoulder blades, and they stood like that until Eleanor lifted her head and looked at herself again in the mirror and found in the far corner of her own expression something that had not quite been extinguished. She had not been certain whether she was still Eleanor Hartley. She was certain now. In late March, 5 months after they had moved in, Diana held a conversation in the kitchen that she believed to be private. Eleanor had come downstairs for a glass of water. She stopped in the hallway when she heard voices. Later, she would not be entirely comfortable with the fact that she had stood there and continued to listen, but she would also understand that there are moments when the information you overhear is information you needed to have. Diana was explaining to Colin the structure of what she described as a plan. There was a facility called Sunset Manor. Monthly costs were $4,200. Medicare would cover a fraction. But here, Diana said, was the thing Colin needed to understand once a competency hearing established that Walter and Eleanor were no longer capable of managing their own financial affairs, the family could petition for legal guardianship. And once guardianship was established, Walter's pension, Eleanor's Social Security, and the insurance proceeds from the sale of Clover Street would pass through the guardians. Through Diana, Colin said something about the grounds for a competency hearing. Diana mentioned Dr. Aldrich. He had been, she said, sympathetic to their situation. It took Eleanor a moment to understand what she was hearing, not because the words were unclear, because the implications were. Diana had already met with their doctor. Without Colin knowing, without Walter and Eleanor knowing, she had brought documentation, the plant overflow, the stove incident, the nighttime fall, and she had arranged for these incidents to be categorized in medical records as evidence of cognitive and physical decline. She had done this in preparation for a legal process that would remove Walter and Eleanor's right to make decisions about their own lives and redirect their remaining assets to people who had, in Diana's own words, that Eleanor would never unhear gotten stuck with them. Eleanor stood in the hallway for a long time after Diana and Colin moved to another room. She was thinking very clearly. She was thinking that she and Walter had sold the house where their children were born. They had spent the money to keep their son's family from losing everything. They had moved into a room that was not designed for them, reduced themselves to guests in their own family, absorbed 5 months of increasingly explicit diminishment, and done all of it without complaint because they believed it was what you did for the people you loved. She was also thinking about Audrey. It had been too long. The silence had been for months, the silence Eleanor attributed to distance and busy life and time zones. But standing in that hallway, something rearranged itself. She thought about the last email. She thought about the unreturned calls. She took out her phone and typed Audrey's email address and pressed send. The reply came back immediately. Delivery failure. Address not found. She tried Audrey's old number. The automated message told her the number was no longer in service. She stood in the dark hallway with her phone in her hand, and she thought she is not reaching out. She cannot reach out. She did not know yet if she was right. She would not know for certain for several months. But the question was planted, and it would grow. She went upstairs and told Walter everything she had heard. He sat on the edge of the bed and listened without interrupting. Which was the thing about Walter that Eleanor had loved from the beginning, the absolute quality of his attention when something mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We leave." She said, "Where?" He said, "Anywhere that isn't here." She said, "With what?" He said, "Whatever we can carry." And then he opened his wallet and took out the piece of paper he had been carrying for 2 months. The garden plan she had sketched the previous spring and left on the dresser without knowing he had taken it. He set it on the bed between them, the paper soft at the folds from being carried so long, the lavender and the climbing roses and the dwarf apple tree still legible in her handwriting. She looked at him. He said, "I've been carrying it since the day we sold the house." She put her hand over her mouth, not to suppress a sound, just to hold herself together while something inside her shifted in the way that only genuine tenderness can shift things. They planned for 3 days. The plan was methodical in the way that Walter built furniture, which was to say it attended to every tolerance and left nothing to chance. Eleanor converted the remainder of her mother's jewelry through a contact in her quilting group, a woman whose son dealt in estate pieces. $847. Walter withdrew the accumulated stipend from his library volunteer account, a small amount Diana had not known existed. $312. Together with what remained of their monthly income, they had just over $1,400 and one elderly golden retriever and 2 suitcases in each other. On the last day, Walter went to the library for his final morning of volunteering. He spent 2 hours with a 9-year-old boy named Eli who was learning to cut dovetail joints. Eli's fingers were small, and the mallet was too heavy for him, but he held it with both hands and swung it with a conviction that Walter found genuinely moving. Near the end of the session, Eli looked up and asked, "Are you retired?" Walter looked at his hands on the workbench, the calluses on his right palm where the plane handle sat, the scar along his left index finger from a table saw 30 years ago, the stiffness in his knuckles that had been there so long he no longer noticed it except when he did. "No," Walter said, "I never retired." He meant it about more than carpentry. That evening was the evening they left. And at the kitchen table in the dark, just before the side door, Walter set down the photograph of his 3 children in front of a white house with green shutters in the year 1998. He was not abandoning them. He was leaving behind the particular grief that had accumulated in the space between who they had been and what had happened. He was choosing to carry only what could help him move forward. Eleanor had the garden plan in her pocket. She had decided not to leave it. Walter had kept it for 2 months across the worst of what they had endured, and that meant something she did not have a word for. She would keep it until she found a use for it. The door opened without a sound. The night air was cold and smelled of wet soil, and the first suggestion of something green coming up through the last of the frost. Biscuit walked between them down the side path to the street. The neighborhood was quiet. A car passed 2 blocks away. Walter said quietly, "No turning back." Eleanor said, "Only forward." They walked 6 blocks to the bus stop in the dark, moving carefully because of Walter's hip and the suitcases. And they sat on the bench and waited, and above them, the sky was clear and full of stars in the way the sky gets in early spring in Vermont, when the clouds finally break and the cold air holds everything sharp and still. They had $1,400 in it and each other and no particular destination. It was the most freedom either of them had felt in 5 months. The bus terminal at 2 in the morning smells like industrial cleaner, and something underneath it that the cleaner was never strong enough to reach. Walter sat with both suitcases between his knees and watched the room. A man in a surplus jacket was asleep across 3 plastic chairs with his boots still on. A young woman was nursing an infant in the corner, with the self-contained focus of someone who has stopped caring what strangers think. 2 teenagers sat on the floor near the vending machines sharing earbuds, their heads tilted together. The fluorescent lights above the main concourse flickered at intervals too irregular to predict which was its own specific kind of exhaustion. Eleanor sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap. Biscuit lay across their feet. The weight of the dog was warm and concrete, and Walter found he was grateful for it. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was nothing urgent to say, and they had spent enough years together to know the difference between a silence that needs filling and one that needs respecting. Then Walter said, "We have $1,459. Eleanor said, "I know. At $40 a night for a room, $20 a day for food, that's roughly 18 days before we're completely out." 18 days, she said, not a question, a calculation she was running alongside his. After that, he said, and stopped. She looked at him. 18 days is enough time to find an answer. He didn't say anything. She was right, and he knew she was right. And he also knew that being right and being able to act on it were two different problems at their age and their circumstances, with their bodies and their limitations, and their complete absence of a plan beyond the bus terminal they were sitting in. He opened his wallet to recount the cash and stopped. The photograph was gone. Of course it was. He had left it on Colin's kitchen table 4 hours ago. He knew this. He had chosen it deliberately. But the fingers that had reached for it by reflex found only leather, and the absence of what had been there for 27 years was a specific kind of empty that surprised him with its weight. Not grief exactly. More like the physical sensation of a door closing behind you in a room you will not re-enter. He closed the wallet and put it back in his pocket. A woman appeared from a side corridor, pushing a wheeled cleaning cart. She was perhaps 50, her dark hair pulled back, wearing the gray uniform of the terminal maintenance staff. Her name tag said Greta. She moved the cart with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact circuit enough times that her body performed it without instruction from her mind, and she was about to pass their row entirely when she stopped. She looked at them the way a person looks when they have seen enough of the world to read a situation without being told the contents. "Terminal closes to non-ticketed passengers at 3, she said. "Opens again at 5. Walter started to say something. Eleanor spoke first. "Thank you for telling us." Greta looked at Biscuit, then at the suitcases, then back at Eleanor, and something in her expression shifted from neutral observation to something quieter. "There's a diner 3 blocks east," she said. "Sonny's, open all night. The owner doesn't make people leave if they order something small and behave themselves." She paused. "It's warm in there." She said it simply, without performance, the way people sometimes offer help when they have needed it themselves and remember what it felt like when someone offered it to them. Eleanor said, "That's very kind." Greta said, "My mother is 83. She lives with me." She said it the way people offer context when they want someone to understand that their kindness comes from somewhere real. "She still knows my face when I come home. The day she doesn't, I'll figure out the next thing. But until then..." She shrugged, a gesture that contained an entire philosophy. She pushed her cart onward. She did not look back. Eleanor stood up and reached for her suitcase handle. "Come on," she said to Walter. "Let's go get some coffee." Sonny's Diner was a narrow storefront with a neon sign that had lost its apostrophe at some point and never recovered it. Inside, cracked vinyl booths ran along one wall, and a counter with 6 stools ran along the other, and the space between them was exactly wide enough for a person carrying plates to pass a person carrying a coffee pot without requiring either one to turn sideways. They took the booth at the back. Biscuit went under the table and settled with a sigh that suggested he considered the situation managed. A young man in a white apron came over and looked at them with the particular expression of someone who is not unfriendly but has also been working since 10 p.m. "No pets," he said. He said it without enthusiasm, the way people state rules they did not invent and do not personally endorse. Walter looked up at him. There was a moment in the hospital after the surgery when a nurse had asked him to rate his pain on a scale of 1 to 10, and he had said 4, and Eleanor had said, quietly from the chair beside his bed, "He built his own house. His 4 is your 8. The nurse had looked at Walter differently after that, not with pity, with recalibration. Walter straightened in the booth. His spine found the alignment it had maintained through 30 years of carpentry, through a military funeral in the rain, through the signing of papers that gave away the house he had built with his own hands. "He's my emotional support animal," Walter said. "I'm a veteran." The young man held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the old dog under the table, calm as a sandbag, not troubling anyone. "Keep him under the table," the young man said, and walked back to the counter. Eleanor looked at Walter across the table. Something small moved across her face. It was not a smile exactly. It was the particular expression that occurs when a person you love does something that reminds you precisely why you chose them. Walter ordered black coffee and dry toast. Eleanor ordered the same. They sat with their hands around their cups, and the heat came through the ceramic, and it was a simple thing, an ordinary thing, but it was theirs. No one had arranged it for them. No one had permitted it. The man who changed everything came in just before 5 in the morning. He was perhaps 68 with a military haircut gone to gray and the posture of a person whose spine had been trained by something more rigorous than good intentions. He wore a flannel shirt and work pants and carried himself with the specific economy of motion that belongs to men who have learned not to waste energy on anything that isn't necessary. He sat at the counter and the young man behind it poured coffee without being asked, which meant he was a regular. He unfolded a paper map on the counter. Walter noticed this because nobody used paper maps anymore. He noticed it the way you notice a craftsman using hand tools in a world of power equipment with a recognition that arrives before the reasoning. Greta came in through the side door in a different jacket. Her shift at the terminal apparently finished, and she spoke briefly with the man at the counter. Walter saw her glance toward their booth. The man at the counter glanced too. He looked at them with an expression that was neither curious nor indifferent, but rather the look of someone deciding something. He paid his bill and walked to their booth. "Ray Callahan," he said. He did not extend his hand first. He said his name, then extended it in the order that suggested he believed names mattered. "Vietnam 71 to 73, Purple Heart. I drive trucks now." Walter shook his hand. "Walter Hartley." Ray looked at the suitcases in the wall and the 2 cups of coffee and the hour of the morning and arrived at a conclusion. "Greta says you might need a ride," he said. "I'm going east. Town called Millhaven, Indiana. 4 hours. Quiet place, small cost of living, won't take everything you have." He paused. "You're welcome to come. I could use the company. Long stretches get quiet." Walter said, "We don't know you." Ray said, "You didn't know Greta either." A silence that was not uncomfortable. Eleanor said, "What's in Millhaven?" Ray said, "My mother, she's 89. I've got her set up in a house there." He paused and something in his jaw changed. "Had her set up in a facility starting tomorrow. Sunny Pines Assisted Living. I put down the deposit in March." He looked at his coffee cup. "Been telling myself it was the right call." Walter said nothing. "Anyway," Ray said, "the offer stands for 15 minutes. I'll be in the parking lot." He went to the door. Then he stopped without turning around. "In the Corps, we had a saying, you don't leave a man. Doesn't matter if you got 3 miles to go or 300. You don't leave him." He pushed the door open. "Applies to civilians too far as I'm concerned." The door swung closed behind him. Eleanor looked at Walter. He said, "We don't know where we're going." She said, "We know where we're not going." He said, 4 hours east. She said, 4 hours east of here is 4 hours east of a competency hearing." They gathered their suitcases. Ray's truck was a Ford F250 dark blue, 11 years old, and maintained with the kind of attention that signals a person for whom a vehicle is a tool, and tools deserve respect. There was a blanket on the back seat that Ray produced without comment and spread across the seat for a biscuit, and this detail did more to establish the man's character than anything he had said. They drove in silence for the first half hour. Outside, the interstate unrolled through the pre-dawn dark, the world reduced to the cone of headlights and the passing red taillights of trucks heading in the same direction. Then Ray said, "You want to tell me or you want to sit quiet?" Walter said, "Son's wife, she was having us declared legally incompetent, taking guardianship, our Social Security, my pension, the insurance money from the house we sold to keep their family afloat." He said it in the flat register of a man reporting facts rather than processing them. She had the doctor in her pocket, had a lawyer, had a court date scheduled. Ray drove. After a while, he said, "Colin, that's the son." "Yes." He know the full extent. He knew enough. Ray was quiet for another mile. Then, knowing enough and doing nothing isn't ignorance. It's a choice. Walter looked out the window at the dark fields moving past. "I know," he said. "Doesn't mean you've lost him." Walter didn't answer that. Ray said, "I left 2 men in a field outside Da Nang in 72. Couldn't get back in, heard their voices on the radio for 11 minutes. Then nothing." The truck held the road with the steadiness of something that knows its job. Spent 30 years thinking about that 11 minutes. What it cost me, what it cost them. He adjusted his grip on the wheel. 30 years of carrying something that wasn't mine to carry alone. Walter looked at the side of Ray's face in the dashboard light. "I'm telling you that," Ray said, "because I think you might be about to spend the next 30 years carrying Colin's failure like it was yours, and you've already carried enough." The fields went by. A water tower appeared and disappeared. The sky ahead of them was beginning at its lowest edge to change. Neither man said anything more about it. They didn't need to. An hour later, somewhere in the hill country of eastern Illinois, Walter's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Then something made him answer. The text had no introduction. It read, "Dad, it's Audrey. I know you're trying to reach me. I'm still here." A. Walter read it twice. Then he turned the phone and held it so Eleanor could see. She read it. Her hands came up to her face and then came down again, and she pressed them flat on her knees. She was breathing in the deliberate way she breathed when she was managing something large. The phone showed one bar of signal, then none. Walter tried to reply. The message failed to send. He tried to call the number. The call did not connect. He lowered the phone and looked at it in his hand. The text was still there on the screen. He read it a third time as if the words might change, as if reading it again could produce the response that the signal would not allow. She had found a way to reach them. From the other side of the world, through whatever Diana had done to their communication, she had found a way. One sentence, imperfect, in brief, and unmistakably hers. Eleanor reached over and put her hand over his on the phone. They sat like that while the truck carried them east, and the sky continued its slow revision from black to gray to the first tentative suggestion of blue. Ray, who had heard none of this and needed to hear none of it, kept driving. Millhaven, Indiana announced itself with a population sign and a reduced speed limit, and not much else. The town was what Ray had described, and also more than he had made it sound, in the way that small places sometimes exceed their description simply by being real. Victorian commercial buildings from the early 1900s lined a main street that was too wide for its current traffic. Several storefronts were empty, several were not. A hardware store had rocking chairs on the sidewalk. A barber shop had its light on even at this hour. The library had limestone columns and a hand-lettered hours board in the window. Howard Jenkins at the Millhaven Inn was expecting them. He had the ground floor room ready, which Ray had specifically requested, and he accepted Biscuit with the uncomplicated goodwill of a man who has owned enough dogs to know that a well-behaved one causes less trouble than most people. The room was small and clean, and had carpet that was perhaps 20 years old and curtains that matched it, and the bed had a firmness that suggested it had been purchased for durability rather than comfort. Walter sat on the edge of it. "What have we done?" he said. Eleanor, who was looking at the curtain, said, "Exactly what we had to. We're in a town we don't know with $1,400 and no doctor, no pharmacy, no plan beyond today. Then today is what we work with." He looked at her. She had been saying things like this since they left, each one arriving precisely when his capacity to keep moving was beginning to fail, and he had begun to wonder whether it was a strategy she had consciously developed or simply the way she was made. She turned from the curtains and met his eyes. "Walter," she said, "we are not the kind of people who give up when the alternative is what we just left. We never were." He held her gaze. Then he said, "I need my blood pressure medication." "I know. We find a pharmacy in the morning. And a bank. And a bank. And somewhere to eat that isn't $30. "Yes." She sat beside him on the bed. One thing at a time, in order. Biscuits settled on the floor beside them. Outside, a cricket started up, then another, the tentative sound of early spring finding its voice in the dark. Walter said, "I keep thinking about the children." Eleanor said, "So do I." He said, "Sophie will be confused." She said, "Yes. Owen will carry that bird." "I know." They sat together in the dark for a while, and then they took their medications and got ready for bed, with the efficiency of a long marriage. And when they lay down, Walter reached across and took Eleanor's hand the way he had been taking it for 51 years, without thinking about it the way a man reaches for a familiar tool. Millhaven in daylight was a town working to stay alive. There was a pharmacy on the corner of Main and 4th, independently owned. The pharmacist, a woman in her 40s named Sandra, who transferred their prescriptions from their Burlington providers with the methodical competence of someone who had done it many times and understood what it meant when people arrived from elsewhere needing continuity of medication. The costs without insurance were what they were. They paid. They had to. The Millhaven Community Bank opened a basic account with their identification and a deposit that left less cushion than Walter would have liked. The teller, a young man named Brett, did not ask questions. Walter appreciated this. By mid-morning, working through the list Eleanor had organized in the small notebook she carried, they had covered the essential infrastructure of a life medications, banking, housing, food. Each task completed reduced the acuteness of the fear, not because the fear was irrational, but because action is its own form of answer. It was Ray again who pointed them toward Ruth Kavanaugh. "Best food in 3 counties," he said, which was the same thing he had said about a diner 3 hours west. But Walter allowed for the possibility that a man who drove the same routes repeatedly might have calibrated recommendations. Ruth's place occupied a corner Victorian storefront 2 blocks from the library. The pressed tin ceiling was original to the building. The booths were red vinyl. The menu was handwritten on a chalkboard in the careful cursive of someone who took the work seriously. There were fresh flowers on every table, not a decorative decision, but something Ruth clearly did every morning because she believed the room deserved them. Ruth Kavanaugh herself was 64 years old and ran the place with the authority of someone who had owned it long enough that the building had taken on her character, rather than the other way around. She was not soft, she was warm. These are different things, and the difference matters in the way you experience a person over time. She brought them coffee and menus, and looked at them with the open assessment of a woman who has spent 40 years feeding strangers and developed accurate intuitions about which ones will cause problems. She looked at Biscuit, who had settled under the table with the practiced invisibility he had apparently decided was his permanent operating mode. She looked at the suitcases they had left near the door. She came back with their orders and lingered. "Frank tells me you're considering Millhaven," she said. Frank being apparently what people in town called Ray. "Exploring options," Walter said. She nodded slowly. "We have a lot of options here," she said with a tone that managed to be both sincere and dry simultaneously. "Most of them involve hard work and low drama." She set down a small plate of cornbread that neither of them had ordered. "Eat that, I made too much this morning." She started to turn away, and then as though it had just occurred to her, rather than having clearly been on her mind since they walked in, she said, "My baker left last week, moving to be near her daughter's new baby, and my handyman retired after his hip got replaced." She looked at Walter. "Frank says you know old buildings." Walter said 40 years. He said, "Then it'll keep doing it if someone pays attention. The apartment upstairs has been empty since my son moved to Chicago, utilities included. 1 meal per shift." She looked at Eleanor. "Frank also says you bake." Eleanor said, "Since I was 9 years old." Ruth said, "Show up tomorrow at 5, and I'll know in 30 minutes whether you can do it." She walked away. Walter and Eleanor looked at each other across the table. "It's too convenient," Walter said quietly, meaning nothing comes this easily, not for people in our situation. Eleanor said, "It's not convenience. She needs something. We need something. That's not luck, that's alignment." Walter sat with this. Outside the window, Main Street Millhaven was doing what small towns do at midday, which is conduct the business of living without urgency or pretension. A woman with a stroller stopped to speak to an older man on the sidewalk. 2 boys on bicycles navigated around a parked delivery truck with the precision of children who have grown up on streets wide enough to feel like theirs. He was about to respond when his phone rang. The number had a Connecticut area code. Walter had only one connection to Connecticut. He picked up. A woman's voice, professional and unhurried. "Mr. Hartley, my name is Pamela Greer. I'm legal counsel for the guardianship proceeding filed on behalf of the Hartley family. I'm calling to inform you that a preliminary hearing date has been..." Walter ended the call. He set the phone face down on the table. The table was very still. The cornbread was still warm. Through the window, the woman with the stroller had moved on and the 2 boys on bicycles had turned the corner, and Main Street was just a street in a small town in Indiana going about its afternoon. Eleanor was watching him. He looked up from the phone. He looked at her. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. "They filed," he said. "I heard. It doesn't matter where we go. She filed, which means a court date gets set with or without us. If we don't appear, we get defaulted. Then we appear. We can't afford a lawyer. We find one over some." She said it with the same composure she had been deploying since they left, and he knew by now that the composure was not the absence of fear. He had seen the fear in the mirror scene back in Colin's house, in the way her hands had gripped the sink edge. The composure was what Eleanor chose to wear over the fear, and it was a choice every single time, and it cost her something, and she made it anyway. He turned the phone over, looked at the screen. Then he looked across the table and said, "We're telling Ruth yes." Eleanor said, "Yes, we are." The apartment above Ruth's place had south-facing windows that let in the afternoon light at an angle that crossed the kitchen floor and reached the small table in a way that felt intentional, as if the house had decided which part of itself to show to best advantage. Ruth showed them through it briskly without sales pressure, pointing out the relevant facts the walls held. Heat in winter, the windows opened easily. The bathroom had been updated within the last decade. The floors were original hardwood maintained by people who had understood what they had. Walter walked the perimeter of each room with the attention he gave to any structure. He was assessing his hands, sometimes touching walls, his eyes moving to corners, to the places where the building's age would show first if it was going to show anywhere. Foundation's solid, he said, not to Ruth, to himself. She heard him anyway. 1894, she said. The year it was built, not the year it was last worked on. He looked at her. She said, a man who knows buildings would catch that. The framing's good, he said. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. Man named Avery Holt. He built half of downtown Millhaven, died in 1931 and left behind a legacy that's still standing, which is more than most people manage. She looked at Walter steadily. I take care of what Avery built. I'd need you to do the same. It was not a request. It was a statement of expectations offered with complete clarity. That's how I work, Walter said. They shook on it. Ruth's handshake was the handshake of someone who had been running a business by herself for long enough that she'd stopped having patience for formality. That evening, after they had collected their things from the Millhaven Inn and carried them upstairs, after the suitcases were open on the floor and the small markers of their lives were beginning to find surfaces, after Eleanor had stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the street below and said nothing because nothing needed to be said, Walter found the folded piece of paper in Eleanor's jacket pocket when he hung it by the door. She saw him see it. I kept it, she said. Good, he said. He carried a box to the bedroom and set it down. She stood in the kitchen doorway. The light was almost gone, and the room was full of the particular gray that comes just before you need to turn a lamp on. Walter, she said. He turned. We're going to be all right here. He looked at her in that gray light, his wife of 51 years who had packed china across a lifetime of family gatherings and folded in a moment of weeping over her grandmother's teapot and then straightened up and got back to work, who had said plants can be transplanted and then quietly kept the garden plan because she knew a plan was not the same as giving up. I know, he said. He turned on the lamp. 3 weeks later, Loretta Banks sat down across from Eleanor at the community center quilting table and asked the question she had clearly been holding for all 3 weeks. Loretta was 67, tall and sharp-eyed, with the specific authority that comes to women who have lived in small towns long enough to know everything about everyone and have decided that most of it is not their business. She was not unkind. She was precise, which can feel like the same thing until you understand the difference. You came here with 2 suitcases in it, though, Loretta said. She was threading a needle, her eyes on her work. You pay cash for everything. You don't talk about your family. Eleanor waited. You're running from something, Loretta said. Eleanor looked at her hands on the fabric. Outside the community center windows, Millhaven was doing its afternoon thing, unhurried and self-contained. No, Eleanor said. We're running towards something. Loretta looked up. We just don't know yet exactly what it is, Eleanor said. Loretta studied her for a moment. Then she set down her needle. My first husband drank, she said. Not mean, just absent. I left him in 1984 with 2 children and $40 in a car that needed a new water pump. She picked the needle back up. Turned out fine. Took a while, but turned out fine. She paused. If you ever need someone to stand next to you for something, I know how to do that. Eleanor looked at her. Thank you, Loretta. Don't thank me. Just finish your square. That corner is going to pucker if you don't watch the tension. Eleanor watched the tension. Howard Briggs lived in a greenhouse on Elm Street with a workshop behind it that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil and the particular richness of decades of accumulated craft. He was 71, a retired furniture maker who had kept his shop because, as he told Walter when Ray introduced them, a man who stops using his hands stops being himself. Walter recognized this immediately and completely. Briggs showed him the shop with the genuine pleasure of someone who does not often get visitors who know what they're looking at, and Walter moved through it with the attention he gave to anything worth understanding. He touched the edge of a hand plane that had been filed and set with care. He examined a dovetail joint in a half-finished drawer with the deliberate inspection of someone calibrating against their own standard. That's hand cut, Walter said. Everything in this shop is, Briggs said. You mind if I work in here sometimes? I mind if you don't. The next morning, Walter arrived at 6. Briggs was already there. They worked in a comfortable silence that required no management. The silence of 2 people who understand that talking about the work is less interesting than doing it. Walter had started a table, not from stock lumber, from a piece of white oak he had found stacked in the corner of Briggs's shop, set aside for something Briggs couldn't now remember. Wide grain quarters sawn the kind of board that comes from a tree that took its time. He worked on it methodically, the way he had worked on everything his whole life. One afternoon, 2 boys from the neighboring yard drifted over and peered through the screen door of the shop. What are you making? The taller one asked. Walter looked up. A table. For who? He stopped. Set down the plane. This question had a specific gravity that the boy could not have known about, and Walter had not expected to feel. He had spent months making himself smaller in someone else's house, reducing himself to a guest, a problem, a liability to be managed. He had been told in the precise and reasonable language that Diana preferred what he required, what he consumed, what he cost. For me, Walter said. He said it to an 11-year-old through a screen door on a Thursday afternoon in Millhaven, Indiana, and it was the truest sentence he had spoken in half a year. He picked up the plane and went back to work. The newspaper arrived on a Tuesday. It was the Harrison County Gazette, the weekly, for the county to the west, and it had been placed on their table at Ruth's place by Loretta Banks, who came in early wearing an expression Eleanor had not seen on her before, which was concern without its usual coating of practicality. Loretta set the paper down and put her finger on the legal notices column near the bottom of page 6. Eleanor read it, then she read it again. Then she handed it to Walter. The notice was formal and brief in the way that legal notices are meaning. It conveyed maximum damage in minimum space. Diana M. Hartley had filed a petition for appointment of guardian in the matter of Walter J. Hartley and Eleanor K. Hartley. A hearing date was to be set. The petitioner alleged cognitive and physical decline constituting an inability to manage personal and financial affairs. Their names in a newspaper in a county they had barely heard of 3 weeks ago. The petition did not require them to be present to proceed. A default judgment in a guardianship case was a real outcome possible and legal and final. Walter set the paper down. The morning light was coming through the south windows of Ruth's place the way it always did at this hour, crossing the floor in its particular angle. The coffee was hot. The cornbread was in the oven. Outside, Millhaven was waking up at its own pace. He looked at Eleanor. She was looking at the paper. Her face had the controlled expression of someone making rapid internal calculations. "We need a lawyer," he said. "Ray will know someone," she said. "Even if we get a lawyer, we have to show up. In Indiana, which means they'll know we're here. We were always going to have to stop running at some point." "I know that." "Then this is the point." She looked up from the paper. "We've been doing this the way people do it when they don't have a choice. We ran because we had no choice. We came here because we had no choice. Now we have a choice. We fight." Walter looked at the newspaper, at his name printed in the legal column of the Harrison County Gazette between a foreclosure notice and a property boundary dispute. Then he looked at Eleanor. Then he picked up his phone and called Ray. Across town, he did not yet know his phone was receiving a text from a number he did not recognize. He would not see it until later. It read, "Mom, this is Audrey's new number. I've been trying to find you for a month. I know about Diana. I know everything. I'm flying to Chicago tomorrow. Tell me where you are. Audrey." This time the message did not disappear. Audrey Hartley Pierce had been on 3 planes in 29 hours when she walked into Ruth's place on a Wednesday morning in late October. She came through the door in a rush of cold air in the kind of dishevelment that only intercontinental travel produces hair, that had been pinned up at departure and had been losing the argument with gravity ever since a coat chosen for Melbourne spring that was entirely wrong for Indiana autumn eyes that were alert despite everything, because some situations override exhaustion by sheer necessity. She stopped inside the door. Eleanor was behind the counter arranging the morning pastries in the glass case. She was wearing Ruth's spare apron flower on the left sleeve, her reading glasses pushed up on her head. She had been humming something low and tuneless the way she did when she was focused on work and did not know anyone was watching. She looked up. The 2 women stood across the length of the diner from each other, and neither of them moved for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Audrey's face was doing several things at once, relief and guilt and love, and the specific sorrow of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of their own absence. Then she said, "Mom, I'm sorry, I didn't know." Eleanor came out from behind the counter. She did not say anything. She crossed the diner floor, and when she reached her daughter, she did something she almost never did, which was let someone else initiate the embrace. She let Audrey hold her first, let her daughter's arms come around her before her own went up, and she closed her eyes and stayed there, while Audrey's grip said everything the apology had not been enough to contain. Walter came through the kitchen door with a toolbox at the moment they separated. He stopped. He looked at his daughter, whom he had not seen in 4 years. He set the toolbox down. Audrey looked at her father, and her expression shifted into something more complicated. The love still present, but altered now by what she was about to say. "Sit down," she said. "Both of you, I have to tell you some things." They sat in the corner booth, the one farthest from the window, and Ruth brought coffee without being asked, and then went to the kitchen and stayed there with the discretion of a woman who understood when a space needed to belong to the people in it. Audrey began in the middle the way people do when they have been rehearsing a conversation for a month and still do not know the right starting point. In 2019, and she said, "I stopped getting your emails." Eleanor and Walter waited. "I thought I was getting them. I was getting emails from an address I thought was Collins. They said you were well, that the business was recovering, that Burlington was fine." She stopped. Diana had control of the family email account. The address she used to write to me looked like Collins, one letter different. I didn't catch it for 2 years. The coffee sat untouched. "She was also intercepting what I sent to you. I sent 37 emails between 2019 and this year. I called on birthdays and holidays, and the calls connected to a voicemail that sounded like Collins. I left messages." Her voice held steady with the effort of someone who has processed the anger enough to report the facts. "None of them reached you." Walter was very still. "I didn't know you sold Clover Street," Audrey said. "I didn't know about Marcus's anniversary last year when I tried to call and couldn't get through and thought you were just busy. I didn't know about the hospital, about the hip, about any of it." She looked at her father. "A friend of Collins, a man named Gary Tesaro, who knew him in college, sent me a message on social media in September. He said he'd heard that Collins' parents had disappeared and nobody knew where they were. That was the first real information I'd had in 3 years." The room held this. Outside, the morning was proceeding normally. A delivery truck idling at the curb, 2 women talking on the sidewalk, a dog pausing at a fire hydrant. The ordinary world continuing. Eleanor said, "She cut us off from each other." "Yes?" "For 5 years." "Yes." Walter looked at the table. Then he looked up, and his expression had the quality of a man arriving at a calculation whose result he does not want but cannot dispute. "It wasn't just about the money," he said, "or not only the money." Audrey looked at him. "She was building something," he said, "piece by piece, removing anyone who might have given us somewhere to go, removing anyone who might have questioned what she was doing." He paused. "If you had known what was happening, you would have come, or called, or done something that interrupted the plan. So she made sure you didn't know." The 3 of them sat with the full shape of it. Then Audrey said, "Dad, I need to ask you something and I need you to hear me before you answer." "All right." She filed. "The hearing is in 3 weeks. I know you've contacted a lawyer, but I want to fly back to Vermont. I want to walk into that house and I want to look Diana in the face and I want to make sure Colin understands exactly what his wife did to this family. Publicly if necessary." Walter looked at his daughter for a long moment. "No," he said. Audrey's jaw tightened. "Dad, listen to me." His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. "If you go there confronting and accusing before the hearing, Diana's lawyer will use it. She will stand in front of a judge and say, 'Look at this family. Look at how volatile they are. Look at how they escalate.' And she will use your anger, which is completely justified, to suggest that we are the problem." He paused. "We fight this in a courtroom, with evidence, the right way." "The right way," Audrey said. "Like the right way you handled things for 5 months while she systematically dismantled your lives." The word landed cleanly without softening. Walter did not flinch from it. "Yes," he said. "We did not handle things well for 5 months. We absorbed what we should have resisted. I know that." He looked at his daughter steadily. "But I'm telling you how we win this, not how we feel better in the short term." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of a daughter who knows her father is right and is not yet ready to stop being angry about it. Eleanor put her hand on Audrey's arm. "Let your father do this the way he knows how to do it," she said. Audrey looked at her mother. Then she looked at her father. Then she exhaled slow and controlled, and something in her shoulders released. "Okay," she said. "Okay, tell me what you need." Margaret Osei drove from Indianapolis on a Friday and met them in the dining room above Ruth's place, which Ruth had made available for the purpose, with the wordless generosity that had become her characteristic mode of support. She was 45, compact and precise, with the manner of someone who had heard many versions of many situations and had developed the ability to assess them quickly without appearing to rush. She set her briefcase on the table and opened it, and took out a yellow legal pad and a pen, and looked at Walter and Eleanor with direct attention. "Tell me everything," she said. "In order. Don't editorialize, just the facts as they happened." They told her. She wrote. She asked clarifying questions at specific points, the kind of questions that told you she already understood the answer and was confirming rather than discovering. When they finished, she sat for a moment reviewing her notes. The documentation Diana assembled is real, she said. Overwatered plants, a stove left on, briefly a nighttime fall. None of these individually constitute grounds for a competency finding. Together, framed correctly and supported by a physician, they create a picture she intends to present as a pattern. She paused. Dr. Aldrich is the central problem. His notes represent the medical corroboration that gives the petition its legs. Walter said, "Can we challenge the notes? We can challenge his methodology, his access to the subjects of his assessments, and most importantly, we can challenge the circumstances under which he agreed to document these concerns." She looked at him. "Did he ever conduct a formal cognitive assessment of either of you, a standardized test?" "No," Eleanor said. "He saw us for regular checkups." Then his documentation represents observational notes provided to him by a third party and incorporated into medical records without direct assessment. That's a significant vulnerability in Diana's case. She made a note. But the stronger play, if we can get it into evidence, is to demonstrate that Diana had a financial motive and acted on it before the petition was filed. Actions that suggest premeditation rather than genuine concern. Audrey said, "I have the emails." Margaret looked up. "Diana used a spoofed email address to impersonate Colin in communications with me for 3 years," Audrey said. "I saved everything. I have the headers which show the originating address. I have the content which demonstrates specific false statements about my parents' well-being designed to keep me from contacting them." She paused. "I also accessed the family email account that Diana had been managing. I found the draft folder. She was drafting replies to my emails and then deleting them without sending. The drafts are still there." Margaret O'Say set down her pen. She looked at Audrey for a moment with an expression that was the professional equivalent of a poker player looking at a very good hand. "Send me all of it tonight," she said. The hearing was held in Indianapolis on a Thursday in November. The courtroom was not large. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, the institutional weight of a space where consequential things happen with procedural regularity. Judge Patricia Keene was 58 with reading glasses and short gray hair, and the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years listening to people present their versions of the truth and had developed a calibrated skepticism toward all of them. Diana sat at the petitioner's table with Pamela Greer beside her, and she was dressed in a way that communicated concern without ostentation. She looked, Walter thought when he saw her, exactly like someone who had thought carefully about how a concerned daughter-in-law should look in a courtroom. He looked away from her. He looked at the judge. Pamela Greer presented the petition with the smooth competence of someone who had done this before. She walked through the documentation, the plant overflow and its cleanup implications, the stove incident and its potential for harm, the nighttime fall, and the safety assessment that followed the medical records from Dr. Aldrich, noting observations consistent with age-related cognitive changes and depression. She used the word vulnerable 4 times. She used the word safety 7 times. She used the phrase best interests of the family. Margaret O'Say made notes and did not interrupt. Judge Keene asked clarifying questions in a voice that committed to nothing. When Pamela finished, Margaret stood. She began not with Walter and Eleanor, but with numbers, the sale of the Clover Street property, the amount realized, the distribution of those funds, half to medical debt, half to Colin Hartley's business and mortgage obligations. She presented the documentation of the transfer clean and unambiguous. The petitioner's in-laws liquidated their primary asset and primary retirement security to prevent the petitioner's household from losing their home, Margaret said. This occurred 8 months before this petition was filed. Then she presented the email records Audrey had compiled. She walked Judge Keene through them methodically. The spoofed address, the false reports of health and normalcy sent to Audrey over 3 years, the intercepted messages, the draft folder with its unsent replies, each one designed to make Audrey believe communication was flowing normally when it was not. Diana's lawyer objected twice. Judge Keene overruled both times and kept reading. Then Margaret said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call Walter Hartley." Walter stood. He walked to the front of the room and he stood there, and he was 75 years old with a hip that ached in cold weather and hands that had been doing real work for 50 years, and he looked at the judge. Margaret asked him to state his name and age and occupation. He said, "Walter James Hartley, 75, finished carpenter, retired, although I'm currently employed as a building maintenance specialist." "Mr. Hartley, in your own words, can you describe the events of the past year?" He spoke for 7 minutes. He spoke without notes. He described the fall from the roof and the hospital, and the decision to sell the house. He described moving into Colin's guest room and the first weeks that seemed manageable. He described the tools, the chair, the dietary commentary, the assessment that produced recommendations about nighttime bathroom habits. He described the night he and Eleanor lay in the dark and listened to their future being planned without them. He did not perform any of it. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way a man speaks when he is telling the truth and knows the truth is sufficient. At the end, he said, "My wife and I are here today because someone decided we were more useful as assets than as people. I'm not asking this court for sympathy. I'm asking it to understand that what was filed against us was not care. It was calculation. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a family and a transaction." The room was quiet. Judge Keene looked at him over her reading glasses for a moment. Then she wrote something on her notepad. Margaret presented one final item, an email from Diana to Dr. Aldrich, recovered from the family account. It was 14 months old. It read in its entirety, "Steve and I want to make sure we're on the same page regarding Walter and Eleanor. When you see them next, I think it would be helpful if the record reflected observations consistent with the concerns I've described. The family situation is becoming difficult to manage, and I want to be prepared. I appreciate your discretion." Pamela Greer was on her feet immediately. Judge Keene held up one hand. She read the email twice. She set it down. She looked at Diana. Diana was looking at the table. "Ms. Greer," Judge Keene said, "I'm going to need a recess." The recess lasted 40 minutes. When Judge Keene returned, she was carrying the email printout and her notepad, and she sat down and looked at the room with the expression of someone who has made a decision and intends to deliver it cleanly. She denied the petition. She did it in 2 sentences, citing insufficient grounds for competency determination and evidence suggesting the petition was filed with motivations inconsistent with the stated purpose of protecting the respondent's well-being. She referred the matter of Dr. Aldrich's correspondence to the State Medical Board. She noted for the record that the email to the physician represented a potential ethical violation that the board would need to review. Then she looked up. "Mr. and Mrs. Hartley," she said, "you're free to go." Walter stood up from his chair. He stood in the fluorescent light of that Indianapolis courtroom, and he stood straight, not because standing straight was easy or because it didn't cost him anything, but because it was the only posture appropriate to the moment. Eleanor put her hand through his arm. Colin was in the hallway. He had not come into the courtroom. He had driven from Burlington the night before and checked into a hotel and arrived at the courthouse that morning and stood outside the courtroom doors for 2 hours without going in. And Walter understood this when he saw him, understood it without being told in the way that fathers understand the specific geometries of their sons' failures and do not always require explanation. Colin looked at his parents. He looked at Audrey, who looked back at him with an expression she was working to keep neutral and not entirely succeeding. Then Diana came through the courtroom doors with Pamela Greer, and she walked past all of them without stopping. And Pamela Greer was speaking to her in a low voice about next steps, and they went down the corridor and turned a corner and were gone. Colin watched them go. When he turned back, he said, "I knew more than I admitted, for longer than I admitted." Audrey said, 2 years, Colin, at least." "Yes. She was cutting this family apart and you let it happen." "Audrey." Walter's voice was not sharp. It was simply present the way a hand placed on a shoulder is present. She stopped. Colin looked at his father. "I don't have anything that's adequate," he said. "I know that." Walter looked at his son. He looked at the lines around Colin's eyes that had not been there a year ago, at the way he stood with his weight slightly forward as if prepared to absorb a blow. He looked at the son who had learned carpentry at his workbench on Saturday mornings, who had once at the age of 9 cried in the workshop when a birdhouse he had been building for 3 weeks split along the grain, and Walter had said, "Sometimes the wood tells you what it needs. Sometimes you have to let it go and start with a better piece." "Come to Millhaven," Walter said. "Both of you. Come see where we live." Colin said, "If you'll have me." Walter said, "You're my son." He did not say more than that. He did not need to. They ate that evening at a restaurant 3 blocks from the courthouse, the 5 of them around a table, and the meal was not seamless. Audrey and Colin navigated each other with the careful distance of siblings who love each other and are not yet sure what trust looks like in the new configuration of things. Eleanor talked about Millhaven with the specific warmth of someone describing a place that has genuinely become home. Walter ate and listened and let the conversation find its own level. After the bill was settled, as they stood on the sidewalk in the cold Indiana night, Colin said, "I want to bring Sophie and Owen." Walter said, "When?" "This weekend, if that's possible." Walter looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him with an expression that required no interpretation after 51 years. Saturday, Walter said. Come Saturday. They drove back to Millhaven in two cars. Walter and Eleanor and Audrey in Ray's truck, because Ray had driven down that morning without being asked and was waiting in the courthouse parking lot when they came out, which was the kind of thing Ray did. Nobody asked him why he had come. He was asked nothing and he said nothing, and he drove and the highway ran through the dark and the heater worked and Biscuit slept across Audrey's lap with his chin on her knee as if they had known each other for years. Somewhere in the middle of the drive, Audrey said, Mom, what was it like the 5 months? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. There was a morning, she said, when I looked in a mirror and I couldn't find myself. I was looking for the person I knew I was. The person who had taught school and raised children and built a life worth the name, and I couldn't locate her in the face I was looking at. Audrey was very still. Diana didn't do that with one big thing, Eleanor said. She did it with 100 small things consistently over months. That's the particular cruelty of it. There's never one moment you can point to. There's just the accumulation until one morning you're looking for yourself and you're not sure where you went. She paused. And then your father put his hand on my back and didn't say anything, and I found myself again. She looked out the window at the dark highway. That's the thing I want you to know. It wasn't the court today that gave us back our lives. We had already gotten them back. The court just made it official. Saturday arrived clear and cold, the kind of November day in Indiana that has a quality of apology about it, as if the weather understands it has been difficult lately and is offering something clean in compensation. Colin arrived at Ruth's place at noon with Sophie and Owen in the backseat of his car. Walter saw them pull up from the window of the apartment. He watched Owen working at the buckle of his car seat with the intense focus of a 4-year-old treating a problem as a problem to be solved. He watched Sophie hop out before Colin had fully opened her door, already scanning the street with the alert curiosity of a 5-year-old encountering a new place. He went downstairs. He came through the door of Ruth's place and Sophie saw him first. She was across the room in the time it takes to describe her crossing it a trajectory with no hesitation, no build-up, no navigation, just the pure expression of a small person who has been separated from someone they love and is now correcting that situation at maximum speed. She hit him at hip height and he caught her and the impact traveled up through his bad hip and he did not care at all. Grandpa, she said into his shoulder. Grandpa, Grandpa, Grandpa. He held her. Owen came next, walking with the deliberateness of a 4-year-old who has decided that this moment requires a certain formality. He stopped a foot away from Walter and looked up at him. In his hand was the carved sparrow, the imperfect one, the one Walter had made in a motel room in Oak Ridge at 4 in the morning with a pocket knife and a branch from the yard. Owen held it up. Walter looked at it. The asymmetrical wings, the slightly long beak, the small weight of it in his grandson's hand worn smooth in exactly the places where a child holds a thing he carries every day. I kept him safe, Owen said. Walter crouched down, which cost him, and looked at his grandson at eye level. You did a good job, he said. Owen considered this with 4-year-old seriousness. Then he said, you want him back. Walter said, you hold on to him for me. Owen nodded satisfied, tucking the bird back against his chest. Ruth closed the diner to regular customers at 3 that afternoon and fed them all at the long table she had pushed together from 3 smaller ones. Walter and Eleanor, Colin, and the children, Audrey, Ray, and his mother, Ela, who had driven over from her house on Elm Street, Howard Briggs and Loretta Banks, who arrived at 4 bearing a pie she claimed to have made the previous evening and which was by any objective measure exceptional. Ruth moved between the kitchen and the table with the efficiency of a woman in her own domain, producing food in quantities that communicated something beyond hospitality, something closer to ceremony. Sophie sat between her grandparents and divided her attention between them with complete equity, touching Eleanor's hand and then Walter's shoulder, and then Eleanor's hand again, as if conducting an ongoing audit of their presence. Owen sat across from Howard Briggs and studied the old man with the unself-conscious scrutiny of a child who finds craftsmen inherently interesting. Briggs, who had no grandchildren of his own, answered Owen's questions with patience and specificity, treating the 4-year-old as someone whose curiosity deserved a real answer. Colin sat at the far end of the table and was quiet in a way that was not the quiet of exclusion, but of someone who understands that he has not yet earned the right to take up space and is allowing the room to reorganize itself around his presence gradually. Near the end of the meal, when the children had migrated to a corner with Biscuit and a plate of Loretta's pie, Walter moved to sit beside his son. They did not say much. Walter told him about the oak table he was building in Howard's shop. Colin asked about the joinery, and Walter described it, and for a few minutes they were just two men who knew the same craft talking about wood, which had always been the language available to them when other languages failed. Then Colin said, "I'm going to file for divorce." Walter looked at him. "There's nothing there that can be repaired," Colin said. "I understand that now. I needed to understand it for longer than I did." He was looking at his coffee cup. "I'm sorry it cost what it cost before I got there." Walter was quiet for a moment. "When you were 9," and he said, "you built a birdhouse. You worked on it for 3 weeks. You remember that?" Colin looked up. "It split. It split because you used a piece of pine that had a check in it I should have caught before I gave it to you. That was on me." Walter looked at his son. "But you came back the next Saturday and started a new one. Better wood. You took your time. That one didn't split." Colin held his father's gaze. "Take your time," Walter said. "With the kids, with whatever comes next. Just take your time and use the right wood." It was the most oblique and direct thing Walter had ever said to his son simultaneously, and Colin understood every word of it. After the children fell asleep on the couch, Audrey and Walter stood at the south windows of the apartment, looking out at the street. Millhaven at 9 in the evening was doing very little, which was one of its reliable qualities. Audrey said, "James and I are thinking about coming back stateside. His contract ends in March. We've been talking about it for a year." She paused. "I didn't want to say anything to you before because I didn't want it to seem like a response to all of this." Walter looked out the window. "It's not a response to all of this," he said. "Maybe partly," she said. "But we were already talking about it before Gary Tesaro sent me that message, before I knew any of this had happened." She looked at her father's profile. "I want to be closer. I should have been closer." "Australia is far," Walter said. "I let it be far," she said. "That's different." He looked at her. His daughter, 45 years old, who had her mother's eyes and had flown 29 hours to find them. "Chicago isn't far," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said, "it isn't." She put her arm through his the way Eleanor did, and they stood at the window together, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. Eleanor was in the kitchen. The house was quiet except for the sounds of people sleeping in the rooms behind her, the soft evidence of a home being used. She moved through her kitchen, this kitchen that had been a stranger space 6 months ago, and was now unmistakably the space where she worked and thought and came to herself every morning at 5 when the world was still dark. She took the garden plan from the shelf where she had kept it since they arrived. She unfolded it and laid it on the white oak table. She looked at it for a long moment. The climbing roses along the fence, the dwarf apple, the lavender in its row, the handwriting of a woman who had believed last spring that she still had a garden to plan. She picked up a pen from the counter. She did not draw a new garden. She did not cross out the old one. She looked at the south windows, dark now against the night, and she thought about the light that came through them every morning, the way it traveled across the floor in its particular angle, and reached the table like something that had been specifically directed there. She wrote two things at the bottom of the page below the lavender. "Window boxes, south side." And then, "This is enough. This is the place." She folded the paper along its old creases and held it in her hand for a moment, feeling the particular weight of a thing that has been carried through difficulty and has arrived somewhere worth arriving. She put it back on the shelf. Walter came into the kitchen. He did not ask about the paper. He went to the stove and heated water for tea, moving in the practiced way of someone who knows exactly where everything is, because he put everything where it is himself. He set 2 cups on the table and sat down. Eleanor sat across from him. Outside, Millhaven was asleep. The street lamps held their circles of light against the dark. Somewhere down the block, a wind chime sounded once, then twice, then was quiet. They sat at the white oak table that Walter had built for himself, with their tea in the apartment above Ruth's place, in a town of 847 people that had not been on any map they had ever consulted. Eleanor said, "Audrey wants to move back." "I know. Colin is going to be all right." "I know that too." She looked at him. "You're not surprised by any of this." "I'm surprised by all of it," he said. "Every single day since we walked out that door, I have been surprised. I just stopped expecting to not be surprised." She considered this. "That might be the wisest thing you've ever said," she told him. "Don't tell Dale Morrow. He thinks I peaked intellectually around 1984. She laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that happens when you are genuinely taken off guard by something funny, and it moved through the kitchen like something that had been held back for a long time and was now free to go where it wanted. Walter smiled at his wife across the table in the kitchen that was theirs. He had built things his whole life, House's furniture, the specific architecture of a marriage that had held through the death of a son and the loss of a home, and 5 months of deliberate diminishment in a midnight escape, in a bus terminal at 2 in the morning, in a courtroom in Indianapolis, and everything that precedes and follows the moments when you find out what you are actually made of. He had built all of those things, and they had all stood. He reached across the oak's surface and took Eleanor's hand, the same hand he had been taking for 51 years across kitchen tables and hospital bedsides, and the bench seat of a bus at 1 in the morning, and the booth of a diner in a town they had never heard of. The window above the sink showed him his own reflection briefly before his eyes adjusted to the dark beyond the glass. He looked like himself. He looked like a man who had been somewhere difficult and had come back from it with all the things that mattered. He looked like Walter Hartley. He turned back to his wife. The tea was warm. The house was quiet. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall soft and without urgency, covering Millhaven in the particular silence that belongs to beginnings.